Mental health is no laughing matter whatsoever with the railroad industry, but distraught levels of panic and destruction rage in two Illinois towns. Fire rescue units were startled by the horrific impact of hazardous materials that could leave victims with sixth-degree burns. We have two reports, one from Jim Axelrod and Russ Mitchell. With the heat and freight cars burning over 3,000 degrees, the wreckage at Murdoch, Illinois continues to emphasize the nature of dangers when hazmat materials are being transported by rail. This wreck in Murdoch illustrates the flammable gas and liquids and corrosive substances fully ignite a BLEVE. The BLEVE stands for Boiling Liquid Expanding Vapor Explosion. The heat cannot be held under its own pressure and explodes fully when the content pressures go beyond the limits. The impact can send a shockwave of over 1,200 feet or more, depending on the flash point. An explosion was imminent of occurring. Nobody was killed, but two people were injured when the propane tanker thrusted its steel shell on one of the victims, who was later released after a night in the hospital. There were no intensive care units whatsoever, but the impact would have been worse than imagined. Railroad policies around the USA emphasized the critical dangers of its fatal nature, a fatal nature that could pose itself as a deadly and fatal threat. Corrosive solvents were confirmed from sulfuric acid, charring a tank car body to foam. Despite the contents spilling out of the tanker, nobody suffered any chemical burns whatsoever because of earlier evacuations. Plans for the Illinois terminal indicates immediate evacuation. Cause of the wreck was a broken flange on a fatigued journal box. Locomotive equipment has been amazing, but yet dangerous operation of business. Without Operation Lifesaver, there would be no railroads whatsoever. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, Murdoch Junction, Illinois.
Crescent City was also had infamous explosions due to propane tankers derailing and spilling their contents into the air. Flames shot over 160 feet and heavy smoke gnarled across people's backyards. All the residents were forced to mandatorily evacuate the area immediately. The NTSB confirms that the axles on a few of the tankers caused the derailment. Fire and medical officials also confirmed their water pumps were at the time connected to the electrical utility system. Whenever the wires were cut off to eliminate the electrocution risks of anaphylactic shock, the water pumps were also turned off, and the flames were no longer under control. A few minutes later, the pressure was at maximal level. When the tankers exploded, they ignited incredible force that shears the bodies right off the car's underframes. After the explosion subsided, 15 houses were burned away from the propane fuel igniting. Thankfully, nobody in this explosion was killed, although 12 people were injured that were mostly superficial. There are plans to study the dangers on operating procedures of hazmat goods later on this week after the collision, and with FEMA operations becoming a big part of the cleanup bills, there is no telling whether or not truth and nonfiction can sustain a critical impact. Russ Mitchell, CBS News, Crescent City, Illinois.
And still to come on the CBS Evening News. More examples of fatal dangers at grade crossings, track conditions that cause permanent impact on their citizen, and the reality of why steam locomotives are machines and not toys. When the CBS Evening News continues. Vulnerability on railroads is never uncommon. In fact, the railroads emphasize the safety and workmanship when protecting railroad crossings and trackage rights. Equipment miscellaneous also. People are asking what are recommendations being made during and after the collisions take place. We have reports from Bob McNamara in Fort Lauderdale, Richard Roth in Roland, North Carolina, and Lee Cowan in Weyauwega, Wisconsin.
As the gnarly spot remains at this crossing in Fort Lauderdale, many skeletal remains of bodies are being pulled to morgues for dental records for identification. At this crossing, Amtrak's Silver Meteor was minutes away from pulling into Tampa when it struck and damaged the gasoline tanker at this crossing. 6 people were killed, including the truck driver, whose dental records were confirmed. The cause was the driver's stupidity and inexcusable actions. He had a flawed safety record. An Amtrak F40PH was charred but not totaled. Engineer Billy Parker explained to his side of the fiery story and had no flashpoint to this foolishness. He spoke in a private interview with Richard Schlesinger in document saying, I am I am thankful to be alive, but I'm frightened for what happened to those victims, whose lives were ended too soon. He also claimed that he hit the brakes 1,400 feet before impact and jumped from his lead locomotive after suffering second-degree burns on his left arm. He is lucky to always be alive even today, but his guilt will always be with him and the rest of the victims who were charred soot after their experience had an experience that had no flashpoint to this type of bad behavior. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Fort Lauderdale.
As sparks and steel scraped the rails, many citizens of Roland were shocked that a flatbed trailer was present at this crossing. Former Seaboard Coastline spokespeople at the time spoke about their horrible experience with this crossing collision. Given circumstances under FRA requirements, truck drivers who accidentally stall their trailers on crossings should get out and stay out of the cab. The driver has fully cooperated, saying that there were either no warnings present or fog became the ultimate hazard. NOAA radio did confirm there was fog in the vicinity adjacent to the location of the accident. But how much fog becomes too much? That is one NTSB investigator asked for clarification. The warning signs were not present near the crossing, and there were no flashing lights or gates at the crossing where the trailer collided. A buckled passenger car truck axle was removed upon inspection and was written off as scrap metal. 2 coaches, both Horizons from Amtrak, were buckled and bent like pretzels before they too were melted down. If there's any lesson upon the events that took place back in 1983 in Roland, is that Operation Lifesaver is committed to saving hundreds of thousands of lives when you hear the slogan, "Stop, look, listen, and live to tell about it." Richard Roth, CBS News, Roland, North Carolina. Even the best of technology can have their flaws. Wrecks continuously occur on a daily basis. But in March of 1996 in a small town called Weyauwega, Wisconsin, that shares its infamy in natural disasters. The incident occurred when an 81-car freight train hit a broken rail and derailed 35 of its freight cars, mostly tankers hauling liquefied petroleum gas and propane. The tankers exploded and detonated like a warhead. 3 people were injured severely, but thankfully nobody was killed. The National Guard was called in to decontaminate the propane by detonating an IED to char the fuel away and burn the contents out. Half a month later, all the fires were put out. It could have been worse. Had the lead locomotive derailed first, the results would have been fatal to those on board and no near their homes. Regulations changed forever after the derailment and require all maintenance of ways to fully inspect the tracks for any defects. Breaker boxes were installed for testing any hot boxes in any of the journals on the freight cars when they go over the tracks. And junctions like here in Weyauwega, Wisconsin, and West Bowen, Kentucky near Nicholasville are permanent reminders of how critically dangerous railroading is when it's being put under the wrong hands and the wrong leadership. Lee Cowan, CBS News, Weyauwega, Wisconsin. CBS's Phil Jones has urgent information about the dismal swamp derailment in Suffolk that wrote passenger equipment and made permanent requirements to banish certain types of passenger equipment. After 36 years, it still remains one of the most horrific memories in steam program history. He reports tonight at Suffolk.
At a press conference under the former Reagan administration, back in 1986, former spokesperson Preston Clater spoke to Class 1 railroads on the permanent requirements made to safely operate excursion trains in their areas. It came after a week after the dismal swamp derailment that permanently changed on how rolling stock is certified. Including in those permanent changes are the following. No open-air cars in any of the consists. Wooden passenger cars are permanently banished from the main lines. And all passenger cars and equipment must be equipped with tight lock coupling for FRA certification. And speed limits are at a max of 50 miles per hour through crossovers and 20 through occupied locks, depending on the areas of locomotives. Wooden coaches were banished before the 1920s, after a similar wreck took place near Nashville, Tennessee, where 101 people were killed when the engineer of the opposite train missed a red signal. Most of the victims at the time of the wreck were World War I gunpowder factory workers for the U.S. Army. At issue, where the meeting was held, the decision was made to have the heavyweights not equipped with tight locks and couplers and all open-air equipment be sold off during its final foreclosure. The open-air coach Missionary Ridge and the baggage car Queen and Crescent Club were scrapped and melted down. By the late 1980s, there were no more passenger wrecks on NS steam up until 94 near Lynchburg, where another coach was scrapped after a piggyback train crunched the frame on a Y track and twisted the body to a 260-degree angle. The car was written off and scrapped about a year or so later as the damages were too much to repair. Even today, Norfolk Southern is fully committed to emphasize the nature of the dangers when engineers aren't looking ahead to easing back on the throttle. Phil Jones, CBS News, Suffolk, Virginia.
Still to come on the CBS Evening News. Correspondent Barry Peterson reports on why steam locomotives are machines and not toys. Frank Courier on how much human error can tear a railroad apart. Richard Schlesinger on how a circus train ends in calamity when cataclysmic misinformation is spread. And Vince Gonzalez illustrates the dangers and collisions in the Midwest when the CBS Evening News continues. Steam locomotive safety is no joke, and the true dangers exist on tourist and steam program operations. Case in point, the Gettysburg Road was one of the most notoriously shambled examples of leadership and safety. Having a crew member's son scorched to the 5th and 6th degree burns all over him was one of the worst examples of leadership. And the reason was very simple. The crown sheet was exposed to the flames, and a staple design from the Kingston, Ontario's locomotive works saved the crew members' lives and the locomotive itself. CBS's Barry Peterson reports on how tourist lines from the 90s are making a permanent comeback with safer training, technology, and the memo.